All right, everybody, welcome. Looks like we're live. My name's Scott Maier. I'm with Artist Network, and this is Drawing Together. So welcome, everybody. We've got a nice gathering here to draw this bridge here. And according to Greg, I saw your post up earlier. This is the Verrazano Bridge. I wasn't sure about that. I found this online in one of the the stock image sites, and I was suspecting it was that, but I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to make a fool out of myself. So thank you for confirming that. Welcome, everybody. Hope everybody had a good holiday season. We're heading into New Year's, and I don't know about you all, but I'm excited to see what next year brings. So, all right, I'm just checking here to see if there are any questions. If you are new, I encourage you to follow along. The image that's below me here is what we're working on today, and you can find a link to that in the description. So for those of you who are following along, you can bring that up and follow along with me. We're using some relatively simple simple materials, so I'm really just going straight with graphite today. So I've got a smooth drawing paper. I'm going to bring that back up and kind of talk a little bit more about the image, but the materials I'm working with are relatively simple. A range of graphite pencils. I've got a 4H and I've got a 2B, a 3B, and then this Onyx, which is equivalent to like an 8 or a 9B, so it's really soft. I grabbed two of these, the 2 and the 3B are really close to one another, and I grabbed them because I used a lot of them in the preparatory sketch, and rather than having to go back and sharpen a pencil, I'm going to kind of switch in between the 2B and the 3B. They're very similar, and you're probably not going to notice the difference. So that's why I have the two of them. I like to think about the hardnesses of these materials kind of in the ranges. So when you're at a 3H, 4H, 2H, those are all very similar to one another. So I grab something from that range, grab something from the kind of the low B numbers, and then something from the high B numbers, which are the really soft and dark ones. So that's what I've got here. I've got this retractable eraser that I have kind of shaved down to this, give it a bit of a chisel edge, and I'm going to be using that for some of the sharper edges. I've got my trusty kneaded eraser and my blending stumps. This one's getting beaten up, but I think it'll serve me well for this one, and I've got a new one here. I'm not going to be doing a lot with this, but it is helpful to have the blending stumps. And then for this one, I'm going to actually use a straight edge, but I like to use just a strip of cardstock for this rather than a ruler. And I don't really have a good reason for that. I just like it. So if you need a straight edge of any kind, ruler or whatnot, use that. I guess what I like about a piece of cardstock is that it is just really thin. So I don't have it's not very bulky there. I can get a straight edge, but I don't have a large lip that I have to work around. So hopefully that makes sense. Jonah's asking a question, how did you decide on cropping arrangement for this bridge? This is actually pretty similar to the original image. And really what ultimately, when I was looking at this image here, this can sometimes be a problem. You've got this major line kind of exiting right up in this corner. It can sometimes be a problem. I liked it, so I kind of went with that, and that was really kind of a gut feeling. And then the other thing that I'm looking at is that it's generally centered. So essentially, this column here is in the center. This one is off just a little bit, so it just pushes it off a little bit, and then we kind of exit down in here. And I kind of like the extreme, kind of the low point of view that is established here by pushing the exit of this bridge down farther. In general, I like to think about the rule of thirds or the golden ratio, which is a 1 to 1.6 ratio, but I don't spend a lot of time really calculating it out. A lot of it is just by going by how things feel, and in general, I felt like there is a lot of empty space over here, but in general, it felt pretty balanced to me, and it kind of made this vertical thrust of these columns here as the kind of the focal point, and then I really like the strong angle of the bridge. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Those are just some of the things that I think about as I go through, but composition is something that I do like to work on, and I definitely have room for improvement there. So welcome everybody. I love seeing where you're all viewing from. If you do have any observations, questions, comments, I love to see them here. If you're following along, I really like to see what materials you're using, what approach you're taking. But we're just going to kind of get right into it. You can see at the top of the discussion thread, I pinned a comment that has a link to the Drawing Together page where you'll find more resources on drawing, including a way to purchase the materials that I prefer to use. So you can buy these Derwent pencils there if you'd like, and the materials, the erasers, blending stumps, paper, etc. You can all find there. So look at everybody from all over the place. It's kind of tough to kind of read and comment at the same time, and so I do go silent every now and then, but I really enjoy reading everybody's comments here. So sometimes if I'm looking up and away, that's what I'm looking at. So I'll set this aside. This is approximately 8 by 10, a little bit larger than 8 by 10. And it's just a smooth white drawing paper. Let's see, I got to pull up the reference image. It got hidden from me. There it is. So what I have is in front of me I have the screen that you're looking at. So it's a smaller version of what I'm seeing here, a smaller version of the reference image. And so I'll be using both of those to check. And this is ultimately really about problem solving. And my approach to drawing is to use the drawing process to kind of figure things out as I go. And that doesn't always work well for something like this that has a lot of straight edges, a lot of details, a lot of really kind of precise measurements. You know, something that's more organic, you can kind of move things around more easily. So the approach that I take may be a little bit different than the way you all go, and sometimes it doesn't work because it's reliant on the ability of the erasers to really be able to lift the material off the paper. So if you're following along and it's not lifting for you, try experimenting with different papers, maybe different graphite as well. Kind of play around with that combination to see how that goes for you. So I did take actually 2 attempts at this, and it really kicked my butt to get this, to even get to this part. And this was, I tried not to labor on it too much because I knew I wanted to be able to replicate this during this live stream, and I don't have all day to do that. So I'm going to try to get to this pretty quickly. The first thing I want to do, actually, I'm just going to grab my 4H, the light one, and I just want to start building tone up on the page. So you can see that I used a razor blade to carve this back. So I've got a long kind of expanse of that core, the pencil core, exposed there, so I can really lay down kind of a more broad tone. And then with these harder materials, the harder graphite, I like to use the side of the pencil as much as possible to work with, because it is being harder, it can scratch the paper if I use the tip of the pencil a bit too much. But I want to kind of lay down some tone early on, and especially what I liked about this photograph is the kind of the vignetting effect. It gets a little bit darker up around the edges. And I'm not being too careful with this. It's pretty blotchy. It's very light on the screen. I may have to darken this. Hold on, I'm just going to check the exposure a little bit. It works out okay. On this, you can see how gray I really went with this when you compare it to that white paper. So we're going to be building up a lot of material. And I just like to have a tone of graphite to work against, because what happens when you're starting with a bare sheet of paper, that bright white, that's really the whitest it can go. And any mark you make on that white paper is going to feel darker than it actually is. That's part of the relativity of value that can make working with value so challenging, is that we're always calibrating our understanding of the materials to the values relationships on the page. And so we never view a value in isolation. It's always interpreted based on the values surrounding it. And so when we're confronted with a white paper, it makes any mark you make on it appear to be darker than it actually is. And then as the drawing progresses, we continue to adjust our understanding of that value based on the relationships that are forming on the page. So I'd just like to get rid of that white of the page. And one of the things that was, I'm kind of kicking myself right now about doing is I taped this paper down. And so that was a problem in past drawings. It is going to be a particular problem in this one. So I'm going to see how that works out for me, because I realized in that preparatory drawing I was moving that thing around a lot in order to get to the right angles. We'll see how we do. Let's see. Oh, that's right. I'm going to grab this paper towel. I'm going to be using this a bit more to kind of soften and blend. Just getting a light tone on there. Greg is asking about the paper. This is not a cotton paper. This is actually some of this stuff. This is the Hanamulla paper I've been using a lot throughout this series. So it's a pretty heavyweight paper, but it's really just a smooth, regular drawing paper. Yeah, the cotton rag that I like to use often just has a bit more tooth to it, and for this one I thought it'd be better to have a smooth surface. So one of the things that, again, we talked about earlier in the composition is that you really get a strong diagonal from corner to corner. So let me pull it up. This portion of the deck, this kind of the lower portion of this deck really kind of exits that corner, and you can continue that line essentially out this corner down here. So if you're using paper that's proportioned the same way that mine is, which is generally about an 8 by 10, you can start by establishing roughly a line here, and that will help to anchor things a bit for you. And what I really like too about this this point of view is the 3-point perspective, where you can really see how, especially these vertical columns here, start to taper at the top, and as they kind of converge on that kind of a vanishing point that extends off the page. And so I may let some of these lines curve a little bit to play around with that perspective. And I'm just establishing a gesture here. And I'm kind of doing some mental angle sighting. So I can look at the reference image here, and I can also look at the screen, the same screen that you're looking at. And if I kind of fix my gaze on the reference image on the left, but pay attention to what's happening on the kind of the movement on the drawing surface, I can start to arrive at generally the correct angles here, the correct perspective. So I'm still using this overhand grip. I do feel there's a little, something's catching in here that is scratching the paper a little bit, but that's all right. And as for those of you who have been drawing with me for a while, you kind of know that I like to start with a rough gesture. It gets information on the page that I can then react to and make specific decisions about adjusting. And as we get into this curve, what I want to do is start to break that curve down into a sequence of shorter, straighter marks. And it's turned into a hot mess back in here. And so this is what's happening is really just I'm trying to kind of do my thinking on the page as much as possible. And that, again, that's kind of part of my drawing process, and I'm trying to see how this works out here, is to allow the drawing itself to kind of illuminate something about the subject. I want to solve the problem through the drawing process rather than figure it out and kind of map it out some other way. So, for example, an easier way to get this done would be to project it or put it on, onto a light table and kind of essentially trace the image. But I'd like to try to see if I can figure this out through the drawing process itself, rather than using those tools. And that's what it makes this really tricky. This is a tough subject to do that with. But that's what drawing together is all about, right? It's like we give ourselves a challenge, and then we're using that to further our skills. It's not necessarily about making a great drawing, but drawing well. And then through this too, you start to kind of figure things out in terms of the structure of the bridge. You know, the way some of these forms kind of lock together. You know, if I look down under here, you know, there's this horizontal support that's holding the deck here. And then if we observe how they interlock, how it interlocks between these vertical columns, and we can then start to see shapes of negative space in here that I can compare. So as I looked at this now, it feels to be more of a square than a rectangle. It's a vertical rectangle in the reference image. And so that gives me kind of a red flag that says I need to look at these proportions again. So still just using the 4H, so it's a light graphite, but I'm trying to use the side of the pencil as much as I can at this point to encourage it to really just kind of float on the surface. If I switch to this tripod grip, there's a chance that I'll emboss the page, and that's going to cause me some trouble later on. Jan JOK is asking, what tape am I using? Oh gosh, I don't know. I've got several kind of just drafting tapes that I use. This is actually just a straight up masking tape, which is probably not a good idea. In general, I like to use an acid-free drafting tape, which has a low tack, and it's not going to transfer any sort of acid to the paper. But this being an exercise more than anything, I didn't really pay much attention to it, and I just grabbed a straight kind of yellow masking tape. So if you're using it for watercolor, and especially if you're planning on preserving anything or creating a finished work, then don't use what I'm using right now. Use an acid-free drafting tape. It's one of the things that can really cause trouble down the road, are adhesives. So, and this is probably a higher tack than is probably safe for this drawing. It'll rip up the paper. So, but like I said, I didn't give it a whole lot of thought, because it's really more about the act of drawing than the drawing itself, and kind of solving the problem of this bridge. And then, you know, as I solve that problem more, if this is a drawing that I really like and I want to create a finished version of it, then I would, you know, use the correct materials. All right, so let's see here. I'm feeling a little bit better about these overall proportions. And so as I block these in, the main kind of masses are working out okay. And if I'm going to use some hatching to kind of block in some values, I might as well have them use some kind of contour hatching. So use the marks that reinforce the perspective. And so what I'm kind of thinking about as I do this is generally, I know the horizon line is down here. There's a vanishing point off the page off to the right that any kind of parallel lines along this deck would converge to. And I'm not going to be super precise about this, but I do want to kind of have that in mind. So as I work my way up the length of the bridge, I can start to change the angle such that they seem to kind of radiate out from that common point. And it's not going to be a correct perspective here, but at least it points me in the right direction. And then I can change the direction of my marks here to kind of reinforce that change in dimension here as we go up to the vertical dimension here of that deck of the bridge. This is still a hot mess over here. So we entered the ugly duckling stage of this very early. So if you're new, what we were referring to is the ugly duckling stage is the stage that every drawing kind of goes through. You know, as we're trying to solve problems on the page, things are gonna get messy, and it can lead to a point where you feel like, oh my gosh, I don't know if this drawing's ever gonna come together. But if you keep working through it, generally you'll come away with something positive. Sometimes drawings just fall apart. Sometimes drawings themselves never come together, but you'll have learned something in the process. And you know, I talked earlier about, you know, that I took kind of multiple stabs at this before I finished that version that you saw earlier, trying to work things through my mind a little bit. And that happens. And in each of those attempts, I tried to stick with it enough to give myself an understanding. Sometimes we give up on drawings a bit too early. And if you just kind of stick with it a little bit longer, what ends up happening is you end up having kind of a clearer takeaway that you can apply to another attempt. So even if you know your drawing is just not going to come together and you don't like it, you might want to stick with it just to carry some of that learning into the next one. So it's basically just having a trial version that we work with. All right, and it kind of occurred to me too in these earlier attempts that part of what is really exciting about this image is actually just the atmosphere, the fog that the bridge happens to be in. And so there was a point at which I was really thinking about this as being a drawing about fog, and there just happens to be a bridge in that fog. But I mean, in the end, it's ultimately the bridge is the thing that this is about. But I do want to make that atmosphere, the fog, an active participant in this drawing. So this starts to become about edges as well. And you know, there's a tendency to look at a structure like this that has so many straight edges. There's a tendency to want to really get in there and kind of embrace those sharp edges and kind of jump into those details early. And so I'm trying to resist that urge as much as possible. So laying a little bit more pressure down here. And I'm thinking about trying to smooth things out a little bit. So I'm looking at kind of some of the light and dark spots and applying a little bit more pressure to the spaces between these darker areas. So like right in here, for example, there's some more noticeable marks, targeting the light areas to fill in a little bit. And in doing that, it starts to smooth things out. And I need to keep rotating the pencil. So I'm rolling the pencil in my fingers as I go, so that I'm not ending up with kind of flat spots in the graphite. And it also helps to deal with any sort of imperfections that might be in the graphite. Sometimes you get little nuggets of something in there that can scratch the paper. Let's see. So I have just a kind of a rough, kind of rough placement of that line back there, that distant shoreline. And let's see. So we're starting that bridge over here is starting to form that back portion here. Now, one of the things I'm observing is that just in the value relationships in the final version, those columns are going to be a little bit lighter than the trees behind them. Right now it's inverted because I haven't placed those trees there. So I'm just kind of making a mental note of that. Hello everybody. Look at all these people from all over the world here. I'm not seeing any questions, but if you do have any questions, feel free to type them out in all caps and I'd be happy to answer them as best I can. Or you all here watching can help answer those questions. As part of what this is all about is we're drawing together as a way to try to share our experiences as much as possible. So some of you like to watch and then draw along later, and then share your work. We have a page. You can find the link in the description below to the show page for this, where you can share your drawings. So as you draw along, when you're all done, you can share your work. And so you can see that I haven't pulled out that straight edge yet, because at this point it would be essentially wasted, and it tends to make more permanent marks. So I don't want permanent marks at this stage. I'm still thinking through the major issues, and if I keep telling myself if I stick with it and I stay with these major issues a little bit longer, like just the basic shapes, the basic angles, it'll serve me in the end. It's one of the things that happened in one of the earlier attempts, is that I jumped to the detail too quickly, and so then it started making marks that I just could not get rid of later on, and I found that to be problematic. So let's see. Wipe this down, smooth it out a little bit, kind of build up that atmosphere. Happy New Year, everybody! We've got a lot of people shouting out. Gonna give myself a line down here. It's not placed properly, but some sort of indication of those. The base of each of these columns here. Let me see. So I'm just doing a quick double check. I feel like things need to be adjusted down here a little bit more. Like I said, drawing for me is about problem solving. We're just using the drawing process as a way to better understand the subject. So I like to let that resolution happen on the page, and a lot of thinking happens through the actual act of drawing. And that was, like I said, that was a bit problematic in some of these earlier attempts, because I made marks that were too permanent, and I need these to be flexible. Sometimes I think about these marks as though I'm kind of drawing in sand, where you can make a mark and then easily wipe it out and move it around. So one of the challenges here is how the dark portion of the feet of these supports are, they kind of align. They create a bit of a tangent against that distant tree line there, the distant shoreline. If it looks like I'm scowling at you, I promise I'm not. I'm just kind of focusing a little bit. Sometimes we make silly faces when we draw. But again, I'm not too precious with edges at this point, and that's one of the reasons I'm using this soft graphite, is because it kind of allows for that. I know I'm going to go a lot darker with some of these marks as I figure out where the permanent marks need to be. So, ultimately drawing is about a set of decisions that we make, right? And so what I'm trying to do is I kind of articulate the decisions that I make, but you may be making different decisions. And what I mean by that is that, with this drawing, we have the composition, we have perspective, we have proportions, we have value, all of those elements that make up a drawing. And we as artists are in control of how we execute on that, when we employ certain techniques. And so you may find it helpful to work with the perspective early on, or maybe you bring in that tool of perspective a little bit later in the drawing process, or maybe you like to shade later in the drawing after you've worked out the line work. And so I'm just I'm kind of showing you my thinking, my process through a drawing. But they're ultimately, you know, a set of decisions that we make that are often very consistent with one another. We just happen to make them in a different sequence, different order. All right, but we can start to see the bridge forming, and it kind of has that the quality of the photo that I really like, the idea that it's emerging out of the fog here. So that's a good thing, and I want to make sure I maintain that, because it's going to be easy to lose that once I kind of get into the details a bit. All right, I'm going to set aside the 4H. I'm going to switch to the 2B, a little bit darker, and I can start to make more permanent marks now. Still not using the straight edge because I want to make sure I get the general angles correct. So just doing some angle sighting, comparing the smaller thumbnail, the image that's below me, over to the drawing. So I'm carrying it, placing it right on top of the screen in front of me. And then just kind of doing a quick double check. So now it's starting to refine just a little bit more. What is happening there? So I kind of lost my mark along this edge. So I'm just kind of making a mental note. I'm going to clean that back up with an eraser soon. And then, let's see, I'm going to come back down here and look at this negative space. I think I need to come in a little bit in these columns here. The angle's not quite right. So I want to leave the old marks on there before I erase out the new ones. So everything's a bit chunkier now than it will end up being. Let's see. We're going to go back through and then sharpen it up a little bit later. What is going on here? Okay, So what I'm observing here is that things aren't lining up in this section here. So I have to do a quick evaluation. Let's see. Still trying to use an overhand grip a bit more. So using the side of the pencil. All right, so I might have to erase this back a little bit. Let's see. And what I'm looking at are these intersection points, the points at which that deck of the bridge it rests on top of this horizontal support. And things were not lining up in there. So I need to just kind of do some quick calculations and try to figure out how to make them line up a bit better. So I'm just thinking a little bit harder right now, so I'm not talking less and less as I try to think through these things. And this inside of this column here is generally vertical. So one of the ways I like to approach creating kind of vertical edges, I'm using the side of the paper. So as you can see, I was kind of moving my hand up and down here, and what I'm trying to do is actually feel what's happening on the surface here as I move up and down that tape. So the tape becomes a guide. So rather than keeping my attention on this line, I'm really thinking more about what's happening on this side. So I kind of set the distance, lock my wrist, and then slide up and down the side of the paper to establish a kind of vertical edge. If that makes sense. You know, so much of drawing is actually putting your attention on things that aren't what you're actually working on. You know, so you know, maybe, you know, working on one area but actually thinking about another. So there's a bit of a bend right in here that kind of forces the perspective a little bit, but it's a bit too much. So I'm going to have to come back in and address that a little bit later, I think. Just kind of making a mental note as I do that. So there's just so many things that, you know, so many problems that we can solve, you know, with very loose marks. And again, this is one of those subjects that it's really easy to initially kind of jump into the details, jump into that structure and want to pull out that straight edge right away. But I find that I do better when I delay that gratification just a little bit and just keep things loose, keep things gestural, and take some time to really think about the subject and anticipate a lot of the challenges before I kind of jump right in. All right, great comment, Sally. That's great to hear. Thank you. Hello from, we got people from all over the world today, from Australia, Malaysia, awesome, UK, awesome, everybody in the United States here. Okay, I'm drawing here from Colorado. It's another beautiful day here. So still very sketchy at this point. And I'm seeing this kind of break in that edge that I want to straighten up. So now what I can do is I can bring out this eraser here and start to kind of do some negative drawing and kind of clean things up a little bit. And I like to think about the erasers, blending stumps, everything as, you know, they're drawing tools. There are always ways to contribute to the form. So it's not just about erasing out old marks, but I want to be making sure that they're actually contributing in some way. And a lot of what I'm thinking about here is just very light pressure. One of the things that can be really challenging is to keep a drawing clean. So you get a lot of questions, in this series about, how do you keep the paper clean? How do you not keep it from smudging? Well, I don't. Things just smudge. So what I've done is just worked it into my process. I know things are going to get smudged, and I'm going to lose definition. So I try to let everything just build up as we go. So I don't put in a lot of detail early on because I've just had too many drawings where I've done that. Put in a lot of detail early, and then it just gets smudged, and I got really frustrated, so I stopped doing that. And but I know, a lot of people work, everybody works in their own way, so That's just what I've, the process that I've kind of adopted. All right. So I'm going to use the eraser to kind of clean up this deck area a little bit. And I want to get this curve just right. So we got generally straight edges here, but we start to curve the perspective a little bit as we come down into this area. So I want to get the scale right, because this feels a bit too clunky, too heavy back in here. So now I'm shifting my thinking here to that negative space, and that feels pretty good. So I think this column over here is good. I think what I need to do is bring this one over a little bit more. So I'm actually going to do some negative drawing, kind of erase out some of the sky back in here. And you may be looking at some of the lights, along the bridge and along that distant shore, and I'm not going to worry about that at this point. That's just too much, too much to think about, especially in something that I'd love to be able to get this done in 2 hours or less, but we'll see. I'll stick with it till I'm done. But and then so I need to kind of fill this in, because what's happening is, we interpret things a little bit differently when they're shapes versus lines. So because I outlined this column here, I'm interpreting its mass slightly differently, and I'm not sure if I'm accurate or not. So let me fill this in and then see how it feels. And I'm not going to deal with any of the details. We've got the cables and such that I'm gonna worry about later. I had a question. What's my name? My name is Scott Maier. I'm with Artist Network. We've been doing this for a while now. This is episode 74, I think, 73. Kind of lost count. I'm busy planning for new drawings as we head into the new year. Greg is saying, yeah, I'd love to see your drawings, Greg. See how you tackled this in the past. Yeah, I know you've done some amazing drawings of bridges, so. But part of this is, kind of putting things into perspective. That pun was thoroughly intended. But if I know I only have a certain amount of time to accomplish this, I need to adjust the drawing process to accommodate that. So if I knew I had a week to work on this, I might approach things a little bit differently. But I think in general, the same process would kind of unfold. I say one of the hardest parts for me was getting the gentle curve of the bridge correct. You nailed it very quickly. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, it's tricky because it's hard to tell whether the bridge is curving or whether that's just the effect of the optics. You look at some artists like Rackstraw Downs, who, he'll intentionally work with the curvature of space. He works on location. And he allows these kind of fisheye effects to take hold in his paintings and drawings. So the curves kind of, the perspective kind of curves and bends, around his point of view. And so sometimes it's hard to tell whether we're looking at something that is an effect of, say, the camera lens, or whether it's actually built that way. So I'm just going to kind of trust what's happening in the drawing. All right, but I feel like I've got generally the mass in there correctly. So now I can start to kind of dig into the details a little bit more. Yeah, I kind of like this. I like the light kind of emerging back here a little bit more. So I'm going to lift off some of that, maybe along this horizon line. So then it's a matter of really just kind of cleaning this up as we go. But if we have the basic perspective worked out, then I feel like we can generally be confident that when we add those details, that it's going to all hold together. This is still giving me trouble right in here. Again, things weren't quite lining up, so I want to adjust that a little bit. And yeah, that all seems very heavy. I think what needs to happen is I need to adjust this angle here. And as things recede, of course they take up a smaller portion of the pictorial space here. And so what that tells me is that slight variations in angles in that distance can have a big impact. So I want to be a little bit careful as I work back in there. That feels it right. Okay. Gonna fill that in a little bit. All right. Let me kind of block this in. Again, just switching to a kind of a vertical mark to reference that basic plane there. I'm not going to be thinking about any of those triangular support elements there. And I think that if you're following along, this is a good time to really kind of step back and assess the perspective and the proportions. See what is kind of standing out for you. And one of the things that I kind of have in the back of my head as I work with objects like this that are, there are a lot of straight lines, right? A lot of perspective to be working in here. If I were on location right now looking at this, I'd be able to kind of lock in on one area here. I'd move up the bridge and maybe lock in this area and then this area. I can't take in that entire expanse from one point of view. Instead, what your mind does is as you scan this length, it stitches them all together to create an understanding that it's a long, straight platform. But if at any given point, you're only taking in a small portion of that information, and then again, your mind is kind of stitching that together for you. So I kind of like to think about that when I'm working with these larger objects, because that kind of frees you up from feeling that you need to have everything really solid and straight the entire length. You can see some really interesting perspective drawings and paintings where those edges are actually broken. And then, because then the viewer's mind stitches that together just like it does in real life. We kind of have that mechanism built in, so we can let the viewer's mind do some of that work that it's designed to do. So then, like I said, it just kind of frees that up to be an option. And I don't know what I'm going to do here. I think I probably will kind of stitch them together and make one consistent edge. All right. Brent is asking a question about the pencil. I've got a handful of pencils that I'm working with. So I started with this 4H. I'm switching to now, I've got a 2B and a 3B that I'm kind of working interchangeably because it's mostly because I don't want to have to stop and sharpen. So I'm working with the 2B now, and if this becomes dull, I'll switch to that 3B, but they're very close and similar to one another. And then I have this dark Onyx pencil that I'll be bringing in later for some of the details. So, but it's all graphite today. Got my blending stumps that I want to bring into the mix here at this point, just to start to fill in some of that tooth of the paper. Ooh, I do not like that halo right in there. That's going to cause me trouble later on. So I'm actually just going to lay in some graphite in there. I think I need to just actually, let me use this paper towel to blend it down. I think that's better than using the blending stumps. All right. So I'll start up here. So I'm feeling pretty good about the proportions, but if anybody sees anything that feels off at this point, just let me know. You all have helped me through some really tricky spots and drawings in the past. So if you're new, just know that I welcome observations and people saying, hey, that's wrong. That's all right. That's why we're here together. If we were drawing together in class, that's the role that group critiques play, is that you bring your stuff to a group of people, then everybody shares your observation, right? And you can learn so much about your work. We just try to be gentle, kind with our observations. So I haven't done any kind of real measuring with this, no comparative measuring. I'm just using a lot of angle sighting and a lot of thinking about that negative space. So looking at the shape of the sky or these spaces around the bridge is a lot of what I'm doing. And normally at this point, I would be turning the paper so I could use horizontal marks to build up this column, but I can't turn the paper. So I'm going to kind of switch to these circular marks that are a bit more ambiguous in terms of their direction. So I see some comments coming in. All right, some people joining late. Just so you know, you can view the entire thing. It goes up as a recording when we're all done. And we are 51 minutes into this drawing session. And so I'm still, I'll be pulling out a straight edge a little bit later to help kind of clean things up, but I'm still thinking about it more in terms of that atmosphere. So what's kind of nice is that, with that fog being heavier at the top, I can work my way from top to bottom and from kind of a soft edge to a sharper edge towards that bottom as well. And so as I'm doing this, if I need a smoother, broad area, again, kind of target the light spots between the dark areas. And if you need to kind of rotate your hand up a little bit to fill in kind of a tighter area, go ahead and do that. But that's how I kind of smooth things out a little bit, is you just kind of build up a layer of hatching. And I try to be relatively consistent with that hatching, but it's not always going to be that way. And I don't like to be fussy early on, so I just start to observe the blotchy areas, and then and just kind of fill in the spaces in between. Let's see, I just want to get some marks down in there that indicate that base area. But I feel like these angles are working out. We saw earlier how these columns are really kind of bending, and so I feel like I straightened it out properly. And if I can, I want to give it just a slight curve, because if I were on location right now, looking horizontally at these bases, those vertical edges would appear to be perfectly vertical. And as I look up, then that three-point perspective starts to take place, and then this becomes so far away from me that it really starts to recede. And so there is kind of a curvature that happens. And so even though I know these to be perfectly straight or generally straight, I'm going to kind of rely on my understanding of perspective a bit to actually make these curve just slightly. So I want these to be a bit more vertical right in here. And by the time we get to the top, then they start to kind of acquire a bit of an angle. Okay. Just scanning, looking for any areas to adjust. I'm going to lay down some more graphite up here. I just want to get darker up here. I want to use a little bit of atmospheric perspective to start to visualize this as a three-dimensional object on the page. So I'm just laying down a bit more. This is the part that's really tricky because I want to be able to just turn the paper, and I can't. You know, one of the things I thought about as before I did this drawing, I'm like, you know what, maybe today I won't tape it down. And then as I was getting things set up, that thought just completely erased itself from my mind, and I forgot all about that as an idea, because that's what I always do is I tape this down. Now I'm kicking myself. I suppose I could pick it up, but I don't know. I'll embrace the challenge for now. All right. Well, I'm glad you all are appreciating it. And those of you who are appreciating it, I'm glad this is helpful. I know it's really helpful for me. This has made my year being able to start up these drawing sessions. So it's just nice to be able to gather with a group of you and draw. So I'm switching to the sky area right now because I just need to clear my head a little bit. And I know I have some work to do in this area, so I'm just going to kind of move on into this space, and it requires a little less thinking. And you know, I really like to have areas like that in a drawing where I can kind of escape a little bit, because it's really helpful. I don't know about you all, but by the end of these drawings, my brain is thoroughly thoroughly overwhelmed, and I get really just kind of mentally exhausted. Drawing it takes mental power, and it is very relaxing and focusing and meditative on one level, but it can also be thoroughly exhausting. So, and I've learned over years that a certain amount of endurance gets developed. When I was younger, when I was in art school, drawing for 12, 16 hours or whatever, it was tiring, but that was essentially the norm. And then as I got older, I found myself, being just exhausted, after just a few hours. So, all right, let's see here. I think what I want to do now is, what do I want to do now? All right, so I'm going to kind of really start to clean up these edges along in here. This is where I'm going to bring out this is just a piece of, this is actually the rag paper, the light fast draw rag paper. It's just a strip of it that I like to use as a straight edge. And what I do a lot of is just kind of masking an area. And trying to get as much done through this process than anything. So you can create that kind of sharp edge just by kind of masking up an area and then kind of running an eraser along there. And I want to be a little bit gentle in here because I don't want to create hard edges using the eraser, but I'll have to address that a little bit later. I can switch to this edge along in here and sharpen this up as well. And so now I get this corner that I got to deal with. What do I want to do there? I guess I can just use my kneaded eraser and kind of pinch it and kind of get in there a little bit tighter. And as I work my way up, let's see how that works. Come down here along this edge. So I have kind of an angle at the top here, but I'm going to curve it a little bit around the edge of the base. I want it to be mostly vertical by the time I get down to that edge. But you can see what a sharp edge that kind of creates. And I was able to use a straight edge without having to draw a line, because that line can sometimes be a problem. So like I said, it can be tricky to remove later on. And I'm still questioning some of the perspective here. So this will help me to hopefully see the perspective a little bit more effectively. Check those proportions, but I want to be able to adjust them. If I had a hard line around that edge, that would give me some trouble. So I'm kind of losing some of that vignetting that I really enjoyed earlier, but that may, I'll just have to deal with that. I'll have to kind of establish that again. So just kind of masking that area along that sharp edge to create that sharp edge. But I also want to be mindful I can start to kind of clean up the edges here on that column. And just being particularly sensitive to the corners and along in here. And I'm not, my hand is getting covered with graphite right now. I'm not being super precious with this. It's all going to build up with material. And so I kind of raced out a little bit too much, and now you can kind of do that masking in reverse. You're thinking about using the broad edge of the pencil as much as possible. And if I need to draw a line, I'm really just using the weight of the pencil to do that, so I don't have an embossed line. And I know I feel like I talk a lot about that, and I think because it's giving me so much trouble in the past. I would be too heavy early on, and then I'd end up with these marks that I couldn't erase out of the page. So over time, I just learned to be a bit more gentle with the material. And if I need to get in there and really kind of sharpen up that edge, that's what this rubber eraser is for. I've erased down to a chisel point. All right. All right, thank you for some of the comments. Yeah, Tomic Toby, yeah, this is live. We're doing this live. We meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. So welcome. Love seeing all the new faces. And you can find the image, a link to the image in the description below, as well as the materials that I'm using, and links to the Artist Network page where you can share your work when you're done. So we've seen some really amazing drawings. And what's really awesome to see is that we pulled this show together because I wanted to improve my drawing skills, and it's better to do that with other people. And so we started up the show. I feel like my drawing ability has gotten better, and I've really seen that in a lot of your works as well. Some really solid drawings. And it's, the whole point of this is that, drawing is something that we practice and we get better at. So we're also trying to be kind to ourselves and recognize that, we've got lots of drawings to do in our lives. So like, this isn't the only drawing I'm ever going to do. So I don't have to put a whole lot of, pressure on myself to do a great job. Sometimes it's just a learning experience. So, all right. So this is a little bit tricky in here. I do want to kind of create that sharp edge, but we also have that curve. So what I'm going to do is let me think about what I'm going to do. So I'm going to mask off a little bit, and then as I go, kind of rotate my paper to kind of match that line, and it starts to give me that sharper edge. But it's also got that curve. I know they do make curved tools that you can use. I've seen them at Jerry's, the local Jerry's here sells them, like these drafting tools that create curves, but I don't really have that patience. So this is an interesting area. So if we look at this column here, it's kind of light against the darker areas around it. So what I'm going to do, use this as a guide, and my sharp rubber eraser here, kind of score down along this edge. And that creates that sharp edge that I need. And I can come back in and kind of fill this in, darken this area along in here. And again, I'm thinking of the straight edge more as a masking tool than anything. So if I'm working on this deck, rather than start with a line at the edge, I'm starting from the inner portion and working my way up to that edge so that I don't have too hard of a line. And because this is farther away, I don't have to be quite as precious with that edge. I can let things fall out of focus a little bit, and I'll be a little bit sharper with things as we get closer. And we use circular marks back in here because if the marks in this dark area are vertical, it's going to work against that perspective. And because I can't rotate the paper to really get a good angle, I'm just going to switch to these circular marks. Atomic Toby is asking if I can show a little bit closer. Oh, let me see. How's that? There, a little bit closer as I work in this area. Unfortunately, I can't move, because I have this taped down, I can't move things around and the camera above me is locked down. So I might have to zoom out a little bit more, but I'm going to stick in this area here for a little bit. So if we look at this side of the column, we're kind of shearing across a little bit, so we have some perspective to apply there. And we get, because of the structure of that column, you get this thin shadow right up along that edge. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to mask right over that light line that I established. And I'm going to kind of darken in this area. I have to switch. I need to really kind of get in there. But I usually don't like this tripod grip because it pushes the pencil tip into the paper a bit more. Just kind of laying some in there. And then I can mask over that and bring in another highlight on that other edge of that column. Let me kind of turn the corner so I can mask over that again. The one part that's challenging about using this kind of thicker paper as a straight edge is that it does sometimes kind of slip underneath it. But in general, I like it. I like that thinner edge. And again, what I should be doing is switching my marks and running them this way, but it's really tricky to do that with any sort of kind of control. But I think, with something like this that's fairly intricate, and one of the things I like about this process of masking rather than scoring along a straight edge is that it makes those areas a little bit more delicate. If I had drawn a line for each of those edges, it could come off as very kind of heavy. And so I try to keep things, relatively delicate. All right. Let's see. Oh, Toby, you were looking at the picture in the background. I can't quite get in on that one. That camera in front of me is locked down. That's my laptop, so I don't have that ability. All right, so let me see. I'm going to mask this area. And what happens under here, this is really kind of interesting, this turn. So we have generally this wall of the deck is getting hit by light a bit more, and then we turn into shadow. So I want to establish this edge as being light. So I'm going to use that again, use my paper again, and use this kind of thin eraser. And I can create a thicker line by simply kind of rolling it a little bit, kind of changing the angle at which we come over the edge of the paper, kind of rolling it up to get right in against the paper, and rolling it back to pull away from the paper, and in that way getting a kind of a thicker edge. But I'm gonna not being too careful with this edge along in here. All right. I'm going to switch back to the 3B. I'm not going to pull out that Onyx yet. That's a little bit too dark for what I need. So I want to darken this column behind there and sharpen up that edge. And then this gets really tricky in here, trying to observe that the value relationship, the jump between the value back in here and then versus here. I think what I want to do is go a little bit darker along that edge. So let me do this. I'll mask that now. And then just lay down some more tone using these kind of vertical marks. Mostly just to establish that plane, and then we're going to go back in and create those triangular kind of supports there. All right. I'm kind of I'm really nervous about that part, so I'm kind of waiting a little bit on that. So I'm going to move to a different area, back in here maybe. And I'm going to come out a little bit. Is that in focus? I can't tell, actually. Put this back up here. Sorry, I just want to make sure that I'm in focus. All right, sometimes it's hard to tell if it's my drawing or the camera that's out of focus here. All right. Thank you for answering some of those questions about the materials. Yeah, these are Derwent. These are the graphic line of graphite pencils. And then I like to use the Onyx as well. So I'm just kind of adding a little bit more detail, kind of finishing off this back end of the bridge a little bit. This requires a little less precision than up here, so I just want to kind of switch to something that's a little bit more freeing. Again, I like to have some of these areas where I can kind of escape a little bit, so I can keep the drawing moving forward, but not be, working too intensely. So, all right. So I want to start to get in some of this that background in here. Get that distant shore. Again, this is this is where I wish I could rotate the paper. Oh, that's so uncomfortable. That's a good challenge. And just what I like about that challenge is, it forces a certain kind of opportunity to develop hand-eye coordination by kind of locking it down. Like, again, I would normally just be able to rotate the paper underneath my hand to get the angle that I want. But because I can't do that, it gives me an opportunity to become more kind of, I don't know, expand my range of motion a little bit more. So one of the areas is down in this area. It's going to get, I'm going to use the Onyx down in here where I need to go a little bit darker. So this is reading as relatively dark, but it's still actually pretty light compared to where I can go with the Onyx. And so it's kind of making a mental note of that. Okay. And I'm not being too, I don't want to be too sharp with that edge back there. And making it a little bit softer than what I'm seeing in the reference photo, in hopes that that will actually create a little bit more depth. I kind of like the atmosphere in this, so I'm going to use that to my advantage and kind of amplify it a little bit in the drawing. And then, you know, creating that distant horizon rather than drawing a line and filling it in, I'm just really just creating these short vertical marks. And then when you put them together, they start to read as trees. All right. Artists need tables that can be rotated, and that's a fact. Yeah, this is actually the table that I'm working on now. It's an easel that moves up and down. But what's good, this is one of those artistic easels. I don't know if you've heard about that. It's artistic. And you can actually rotate the canvas and tilt it up and down. It's pretty cool stuff. There's a video, I reviewed it for Artist Network recently, and it was really cool to play around with. But yeah, you can kind of change things exactly how you want. Lay it flat, vertically, spin it around. It really helps with getting in the right angles. Oh, that's right. There's a horizontal support back in here that I need to suggest. All right, just checking to see how that reads, looking at the screen from a distance a little bit. Okay. When I work down in this area, I'll have to kind of widen out the shot a bit so we can see that. But so Greg, if you're still watching, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. So when you tackle a subject like this, what you do in terms of the perspective. Talking to Greg DiNapoli, is that your last name? Does some pretty amazing work. He has some comments in the thread if you haven't checked it out, from some really cool architectural work. And so he confirmed that this is the Verrazano Bridge. All right, let's see. So this is a bit strong, the contrast in here. You can kind of just smooth it out. But now what I want to do is I want to start to build in some of the detail in there. And while I'm kind of thinking through what I want to do, I'm just kind of working at some areas that require a little bit less thought. So like this kind of dark stripe down in here. I'm trying to figure out how can I explain what how I approached it earlier in my earlier attempt at this. So let's see. So I think what I want to do is I want to start, there are these elements along there. This is where the cables are attached, it looks like, and there's just all the beams are all kind of bolted together. And it kind of creates this ribbing. And then if we start in one spot, it'll kind of start to expand into other areas. So let me try to describe what that means. So I've got these two columns as landmarks that I can use. And if I'm happy with that proportion, now I can look at that negative space and I can start to kind of map out some of those those support pieces. Now it recedes from, it's receding from us, so as we move back into space, things appear to get closer and closer together on the page. Greg is saying, constantly reworking them as I go. I'm always amazed how quickly you nail them down no matter the subject. Well, I'm glad to hear that. You obsess over the proportions for hours. Yeah, that's something I should be doing. And then Toby has asked a question, how do I get motivation to drawings like that? So really, ultimately, the motivation for this series is that I want to become better at drawing. And in particular, what that means is getting to the correct proportions, perspective, value, shading, things like that more quickly. Because the drawing process allows me to better understand the world around me. It's about understanding the subject, whatever you're studying, and using drawing to do that. And they kind of feed one another. The better you understand the subject, the better your drawing is going to be. The better your drawing gets, the better your understanding of the subject becomes. And you have to challenge yourselves in particular ways in order to get that. So drawing is really an act. It's an object. This is a drawing, but then there's also drawing. There's the act of it, and I try to prioritize the act of it more than anything. And then with the thinking that is if I'm really enjoying the process and I'm learning something from the process, that it'll show in the final result. And so that is ultimately my motivation there. And what I think about when I choose a subject for the series is what is going to give me something that is going to push me a little bit farther. I need something that I can achieve, that I can actually do, but I want it to be a little hard, right? I want there to always be the threat that it could just fall apart, and because that tells me that I'm improving. If I'm doing something that I know I can do, I'm not going to get a whole lot better. So that's kind of my thinking in terms of motivation. That's a really great question. So okay, back to this idea. As I'm looking at these pieces here, and I'm counting. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 of them between these two posts, and they gradually get closer together. So this one, here we go. So I can start to kind of map these out. Now there are rules in perspective that will help me to get there, and I'm not going to take the time to actually do that because to be honest, that type of thinking and mapping makes my brain hurt. And so what I like to do is, rely on something like this, just kind of trusting my eyes and taking my time and hoping that it'll all come together in the end. So I can work my way back. And so now there's, a ton of these little indicators back in here, these little marks. And I don't have the ability to really kind of map them out all precisely. So I'm just kind of thinking through and suggesting things as much as possible. But I think that's a really good question about being motivated for this. And I'd love to hear from you all, like what kind of things motivate you to draw, and where do you find that you might need, assistance in terms of being motivated. I've never really had that problem, and of course there are days where I just don't feel like drawing, and that's one of the reasons I put together this series, is that I realized that I had neglected it for far too long, because I in favor of painting, which is the thing I love to do the most. But I realized that also my painting was inhibited because I hadn't been drawing as much as I should be. So I'd love to hear from you, like your thoughts on the motivation. Like what do you find motivated to draw? So I want to kind of switch my marks here and make them horizontal. And I feel like this corner needs to be sharp. So what I'm going to do is I may have to kind of over erased, and I'm going to come back in and sharpen that up. There we go. So back to these portions here, what I'm going to do is kind of work my way up the deck. So before I place one of these things, I'm doing two things. I want to think about where is it relative to other portions on the bridge, other landmarks on the bridge, and how does it feed in with the spacing? Does it feel like it's correctly spaced? And I'm doing that at this stage, not earlier, it's because I need to have the basic perspective of the bridge established, and from there it will tell me if something feels off with these smaller bits. All right, if I've done my job correctly in getting the basic perspective drawn correctly, effectively, then it should look weird if I've placed any of the details incorrectly. So this is just a little guideline to help me place the ends of those portions. So as I move up to the next one here, I see it's a little bit offset. It's a little bit farther to the right from this vertical column, and then I'm looking at the spacing, and that feels correct. So a lot of it is really built on feeling. Like our brains have, we've designed our brains and our visual system to interpret perspective. We don't take the time to really map out vanishing points and horizon lines when we look at a subject. We just know it feels correct. So there is an intuition that we all have in terms of perspective. And I feel like when drawing, if we take the time to kind of let the drawing unfold in a proper way, it will. We can lean on that intuition a bit more effectively. All right, so I want to start to map out these a little bit more now. Now it gets trickier. So as I'm moving up, I'm really just trying to get a feel for the perspective and the spacing, and doing a quick check-in with a horizontal guide to check where I am relative to the bridge. So we're up on this one here. And if I do a horizontal guide, it brings me just below the curve here. And the other thing that's happening with regards to perspective is that these short horizontal marks, following the rules of perspective, would actually converge at a vanishing point off to the right. So there needs to be some sort of slight kind of radiating effect of these edges. The other thing that I need to observe is the scale. And again, if I have the structure drawn effectively in proportion, things will feel off in terms of their scale. If I am off, okay, then next one comes in a little bit higher. And I know I'm off the screen here a little bit, so. But I don't want to reframe the shot at this point, so. So what I can do here is I can also mask this now, and I can work with some of these. I can start to establish these vertical edges, and there's a slight radiating kind of effect here. I'm going to have them lean in a little bit more to create the effect that they're going to converge at a third vanishing point up there. All right, so what happens now? So now I know with the bridge, we have these evenly distributed forms, and those triangular elements, they kind of come down off of a form and then up to the next one. So it creates that V. Now, it's not going to be evenly spaced because things get wider as they advance. An easy way to do that, if I'm happy with these 4 points here, you've got this rectangle essentially drawn in perspective. If you visualize an X, that gives you perspective center right there. That's the center between these two vertical elements as seen in perspective. You can then drop a line down here through that center, and that's going to give you the point in perspective that's halfway between these 2 points here. And then from there, you can kind of sketch that in. So I'll just do a quick kind of check-in with that to give myself some sort of indicator of where, like what angle these need to be. And then as I map those out, I'll kind of show you kind of a cool thing that happens with those. So keeping these marks really light. So we have, you know, the set of lines here that are kind of angling up and away. What you'll notice if you've done it right is that they'll kind of radiate out this way. So they'll gradually get more and more horizontal as you move up the drawing. And then these ones that are moving in this direction, they're changing as well. They're changing the angle. This one seems a little bit off. And they are kind of, they're gradually moving like this as we move up the drawing. So hopefully that makes sense. I do want to get back to some of these comments. I see a bunch coming in and I got kind of sucked into this, so I just want to take a break, read through some of these comments. Hello, Cheryl from Amarillo, Texas. Good to see you again. Let's see, from Gary, England. Gary from England, sorry. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for the simple and informative still. This is what I call a tutorial with internet to help students improve. Excellent. Greg saying actually gotten better with figuring out proportions since watching the show. That's good to hear. Getting the proportions right is really one of those things that the more you do it, it just comes more naturally. And that's one of the big things that I wanted to improve by drawing to apply to my painting. So when I'm on location painting, getting to those proportions more quickly, I find that drawing really helps me to do that. So I'm glad to hear that it's happening for you. Greg saying subject matter motivates you, loving architecture. If I see a cool building or something I want to draw it while drawing the challenge keeps me going. Excellent. Yeah, it's like that. It's like putting together a puzzle. Monica saying the same thing. And then Box Socks saying I'm drawing a French soldier. That's very cool. Liz, it's good. Thank you for watching. Let's see, just meditation's excellent. Yeah, for me, it's also meditation. It's just a way of kind of focusing and bringing my attention onto one subject. So I'm glad to hear that you're thinking the same thing, Ethan. Atomic Toby is saying I'm on a Discord server and there's a channel called Art Requests. I'm picking some requests and doing them. That's awesome to hear. I know my son, he communicates with his friend through Discord. That's really cool. I'd never heard of that until very recently, so that's cool. All right, Adele, welcome back. Good to see you. Setting up the warp for a baby blanket on my loom. That sounds like a lot of fun. Very cool. All right, here we go. So back into this section up here, what I'm going to do now is I can use this. I have these kind of paths mapped out. And I will, what do I want to do? Actually, I'm going to deal with the thinner lines first because I know that the eraser is going to wear down. So I'm just kind of masking over that line and then doing these lines that are a little bit thinner. Because of our point of view, we're seeing kind of the thin edge of these triangular elements. Whew, okay, and now I can go back in and do kind of the thicker edge here. And I'm not being too precious with the edges, the ends there. I'm going to clean those back up. I'm mostly just kind of giving myself kind of a bit of a map there to follow. And as we kind of work back into that space, everything gets so crunched that I'm just going to suggest that more than anything. Now, back into this, and actually, I do want to give myself a bit of a light edge along in here. And now I can kind of sharpen up some of these edges in here and fill in some of these triangular marks, or these negative spaces. And I'm not going to be too kind of precise and kind of persnickety with this, but this is something that you could continue to kind of mask off and get really sharp with some of these areas. But one of the things I do want to be careful of is, see, I'm breaking these into different sections, and so the lines are not physically continuing from one space to the next, and so they don't have to be super precise, but they need to be close enough that they don't become a distraction for the viewer. So if I were to change my marks and go this direction, that would really kind of pop off the page. It'd be fairly subtle, but we would notice it and something would feel off. So I want to make sure that I'm being consistent with the direction of my hatch marks here so that it doesn't become a distraction. And if I'm being too kind of imprecise along in this edge here, I can always clean that up with my eraser there. But so as we move into this area, this is one of those areas where you can add as much or as little detail as you feel confident in doing, comfortable doing, or you can kind of just suggest it. So I don't know how much more detail I'm going to add to this because, just of time considerations. But now it's just a matter of continuing the same kind of thought process. Once you have the basic structure established, then you can add as much or as little detail as you want. So. But I know for me, it was really intimidating. And I was kind of kicking myself when I chose this subject because I was looking at this bridge and I'm like, that's a cool bridge. And I liked the fog and I thought, oh, that'd be fun. It looks relatively easy. And I hadn't taken any time to look at all the structure there until I started drawing it. And I'm like, what was I thinking? That is hard. And so if you were experiencing the same thing, feeling intimidated by it, hopefully this helps to kind of alleviate some of that, and hopefully you feel a little bit better knowing that you're not the only one. So I'm going to do a little bit of cross hatching just to make this a little bit darker. And the same, I want to be thinking about perspective with the hatching as well. So I'm going to at least be following generally the rules of perspective here to reinforce that. Now there are some kind of vertical components to these, where the cables are attached, and I'm trying to just see if I can understand something about the pattern there. But in general, it looks like they come in kind of just behind these pieces here that we've already established. So I can use those as a bit of a guide. All right, and again, I haven't done anything with the suspension part of the bridge, the cables there. All right, what do I want to do here? Okay, I want to kind of get back in. I started to kind of map out this and add a little bit of detail to this section here. I'm really torn right now because I want to be responding to all of your comments if they're coming in, and I feel bad if there's any questions coming in that I'm missing. But let's see. All right, Cheryl, I'm glad that's a helpful tip, using the straight edge with the eraser. I mean, that's the thing what I've found with, when working with students who prefer to use straight edges, there's nothing wrong with using a ruler to create a straight edge. It's, it's a tool just like anything else. And that's always the kind of the question you get from students is, oh, well, is it cheating? I'm like, no, it's not cheating. It's just a tool. But there's more than one way to use it, right? And the challenge when working with a straight edge is it can often make a very kind of artificial and heavy mark. It can lead to that. And so I'd like to try to find new ways of working with it, so you get that straight edge without the negative side effects, I guess, of that. So that's where I just kind of started masking more than anything. So in here, this gets relatively dark. And there is a bit of, you can see just a bit of that underside where it gets a little bit darker. I want to establish that. It's good to see new faces here. Let's see. If you are new, welcome. Again, we meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. What do I have next week? Oh yeah, that's right. Next week is this little guy. It's Mockingbird, working on some tone paper. So I just worked on that this morning. It'll be a fun one. So come back and join us for that. And then I'm going to be addressing the light on the bridge here later on in the drawing process. So just so you know. All right, and then I think I want to. This area requires a little less thinking, so I'm kind of decompressing a little bit, working up in that area. All right. Whew. SKE. Asking you the pencil that I'm using right now. This is just a 3B that I have now, but I do have I have the Onyx that I'm going to be bringing in a little bit later to expand that value range, and that's about equivalent to an 8B, pretty close to that, I think. And I think Derwent says it's like an 8 or 9B equivalent. All right, I want to be careful with this edge, so I'm going to mask this, and actually I'm going to run some horizontal marks here. And then what that does is it just helps to reinforce that perspective along that edge. Because if I draw a heavy line along there, it could just end up flattening out that form. So that's why I prefer to mask it. All right, now what do we have here? Okay, so now stemming from these elements here, these points of contact, there are kind of lateral supports across here. And so you can see how the perspective kind of builds off of everything. We started with the big structure of the bridge, right? And once we're happy with the placement of the columns and the basic perspective of this deck, then you start to make things smaller and smaller. You start to deal with smaller and smaller areas. And if we've arrived at a perspective here that feels generally correct, then we can continue to expand that into other parts of the drawing. So we can start to build in these supports here. Now, these lines that I'm drawing in here, following the rules of perspective, they would meet at the same vanishing point that these edges would meet at. So if we were to extend these lines far enough, they would all meet at one point on the horizon line. I don't have the ability to create that vanishing point in reality here because I'd have to put it off about 8 feet from the table here. But I can hold that in my mind and know that there should be generally a sense that they're kind of radiating out from that point as I do that. So as I work my way back, these become more horizontal, more in line with the edges here. And as I work my way up the deck closer to us, they're going to increase their angle a bit from there. So I don't think that straight edge is actually going to give me trouble. So I want to sketch these in and see how they feel. And again, if we've done our job correctly, if we have the basic perspective established with that main box. If I get one of these lines wrong, I should feel it. It should feel off. And I don't need to find the vanishing point to tell me that it's off, but it can be helpful to use vanishing points in orthogonal lines and other perspective tools to kind of help you if you get stuck, right? So that's how I use perspective. I know some of you, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well. If you're doing some perspective drawing, at what point do you bring in perspective? At what point do you think about horizon line, vanishing point, orthogonals, things like that? Or if you're new, if some of those terms are unfamiliar to you, let me know, and we can try to explain that a bit. So this does feel a little bit off. I feel like these are angling a bit too much. So I'm going to kind of flatten it out, because what happened is then it made that deck feel like it was twisting. So again, without relying on vanishing points, I am kind of using intuition more. And I could also be using some angle sighting on the reference photo itself, so comparing those lines to the reference photo and then swinging those marks across. But right now I'm just kind of going by feel right now. So that feels like it's flattening out a little bit better. Oh, let me see here, just seeing some questions. Hello from Liverpool, all right. All right. So now what do I want to do? I want to, actually, I'm just going to run marks this way rather than try to contort myself. So just using the side of the pencil, I'm kind of building up some tone. And what I like working with working with graphite is that you can create these kind of washes, right? You can build up value slowly, and they kind of create these transparent washes. So, but as I make these hatch marks, I want to be thinking generally about perspective, and so have the marks still kind of adhere to the perspective that's being established in the drawing. So as opposed to if I were to draw these marks vertically, it would really kind of jump off the page because they don't align with the edges that are being built using perspective. So, all right. So now with these lines kind of roughed in, that helps me to place kind of some of these kind of dark spots in here that I can start to suggest, because that's not a solid deck. There's a bit of there's something lowered here, and you can tell that I'm not an engineer and I don't know I don't know the parts of the bridges here that actually create the support. My extent of engineering, ended in high school when we were building bridges and stuff out of various materials, or I remember like in elementary school building bridges out of toothpicks, and seeing what stands, and that's about it. That's all I got. That's all I got for engineering. So, so now I can erase out some of these highlights a little bit. The sky holes there, and I'm not. This is again another spot where you can take a bit more time and really kind of map these out. I am just going to really suggest them more than anything because I want to move this drawing along. We're almost 2 hours in, and it was my hope that we would be able to finish this in about 2 hours. That's the 4H. And so I want to start to speed things up a little bit. Because we still haven't even gotten to the cables yet. Well, there goes that end. All right, actually, so before I even go to the darks, I think we can switch to the cables now. This is going to be a tricky spot. So what I want to do is I want to make sure I get the curves right, as I drop in these suspension cables. So what I need to understand is first where they're starting from, which is somewhere up here. It gets kind of lost in the fog. And I can start to kind of indicate that. And then I want to see where it levels out here on the base. So I'm going to check in with several things. First, I'm going to kind of indicate where it feels like it is. And I'm going to double check that. So it's actually just above this column, but a little bit to the right. And then if I draw a horizontal guide across here, I can see where it would intersect those vertical columns. So it's actually somewhere right back in here. So if I have kind of a starting point, kind of a midpoint, and then it trails up somewhere and connects to those vertical supports somewhere up in the distance, I can then help use that to work out the curve. And then in between, what I can do is I can find the general angle right in here. And so now what happens, it feels like it curves up that way. I didn't quite get that right. So before I fix it, I want to get the new one in place. So I'm using the bit of broken lead from before, broken graphite. And now I can go back in and kind of lightly erase out that one that was incorrect. So don't be, it looks like a fine detail, but don't be afraid to kind of work that detail. Like, it doesn't have to be done in one perfect swoop. If you keep your marks light and loose, you can kind of get there and kind of find your way through that. And then right in here is actually the light comes in. And you see it's mostly a curve of light. And then there's a little, I kind of overstated that, but let me bring in the 4H. And this is one of those other areas too where you can decide for yourself how much detail you want to add into this. But if you wanted to, again, what I did is I kind of erased out that stripe. And if you wanted to create them as a series of kind of balls, then what you would do is you just kind of fill in the negative spaces around it to suggest those balls of light. So, but that's a lot of detail that it's kind of making me a little claustrophobic, so I'm not going to do that. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is, actually I'm going to kind of suggest some of these vertical cables there, erasing them down. I use the 4H and kind of let them just kind of fill in the space. Like, I think if you get too explicit with them, then they just become distractions. So I don't know if you all feel the same way, but when I looked at this, it took me a while to really even notice these vertical cables that are coming down from the main suspension cable. So that tells me that I don't need to make them highly visible. if I make them too visible, it actually might feel a little uncomfortable for the viewer. So somebody's SKE, you're working with a ballpoint pen. That sounds insane. Way to go. That sounds wicked hard. So kudos to you. Yeah, that is something. I would love to see that. If you can share that on the Artist Network page, there's a link in the description below the show page for this where you can share your bridge drawings. I would love to see that. All right, so let me zoom out a little bit more so we can see the whole drawing. So as I work on these cables here, there you can see there's some perspective applied in the photo. There, these aren't vertical cables. They kind of angle inward to meet at the third vanishing point above. So what I want to do is I want to establish start to establish at least an outer edge one, and then I can work my way to this angle. I know they're going to kind of radiate from this angle to that angle. So I've got the 4H right now. And I'm not counting stripes because that is just a lot of work and I don't think it really helps the drawing. I just want to be able to suggest them. And so when I'm creating them, I'm using that overhand grip. So I'm using the side of the pencil and just running it along the paper as a guide. But I like using the overhand grip because for me it makes marks that feel more natural. When I switch to this tripod grip, it becomes a bit too consistent for me. And then there's two layers of those cables. There are some that are off in the distance as well, coming off the back side of the deck. But I don't really. So what you could be doing is using these as guides because I imagine that's where they're anchored to, or those back supports there. But all right, darken those up a little bit closer as they get closer to us. But I'm putting a little bit more emphasis on, putting more line weight where they meet the bridge more than anything. So, all right, switch to the Onyx. Whew, let's see. Now what I want to do is, actually, before I do the darks, why don't I erase out the lights here? And now, you notice that as throughout the drawing, this whole area has just gotten kind of just grayed down. Well, there's a whole structure right there that I did not place. So right in here, I didn't place whatever that is. It looks like some sort of utility space. I can kind of erase out some of those highlights. I'm going to soften it with the kneaded eraser. Kind of makes nice soft edges. And then right in here, this light coming in down from here. And there's a light under the deck. that's a bit, I erased too much here. So there's some details that, you know, are left off of this, but again, you can decide how far you want to take that. So now I switch to the Onyx where I can really lay down some darker darks. And, oh, I haven't done anything on the base of these things yet. So right now they're just kind of floating in the water. There's no real grounding to them. All right, so I'm going to finish kind of working on the deck part, and then I'll work my way down to those areas. So that part's coming. And so I can make this light feel brighter by darkening in the space around it. And I'm going to run these marks this way. And I want to have a sharper edge so I can mask that. You just got to be careful if you're using a piece of paper like I am, that pencil can kind of creep in underneath it. But I want to avoid kind of what I did right there, which is to lay a line down. If I do it, I do want to make sure that it's only in a small area. There, that has a relatively sharp edge. But I like the light and the atmosphere in this subject, and so I don't want to kind of ruin that by making edges that are too hard and consistent. And these areas here are a little light. So I'm going to darken these, and I can force the perspective even farther by kind of increasing the contrast up in here in the foreground. How's that work? That works out okay. There's a little bit of bounce light happening underneath the bridge here too that I can suggest using this eraser and masking it. So this is an area where if we weren't 2 hours in already, then I might spend a little bit more time really kind of cleaning this area up, but like I said, we're already running a little long, so I'm going to try to speed things up a little bit. So how's everybody doing? I see Demanchi Dave is saying some proportions are a little off in your drawing. How's everybody else doing? Yeah, hopefully if your proportions are off, hopefully it's at a point where you can still kind of make some adjustments. And if not, I mean, if it's just going to make an ultimate mess out of the drawing, what I've found is if you already know you're going to essentially abandon the drawing at some point, keep working out some of those issues on that page, and because that'll help translate to the next one if you need to. So. And then I can establish these horizontal supports that are a little bit more clearly here, suggest them. So, all right. Whew. Thank you for hanging out with me this long. I know this is one of the longer ones. Usually we don't run much over 2 hours. So, all right. Now we get to the bases here. So I think I'm just going to kind of sketch these in more than anything. What's nice is that they're relatively dark against that distant shoreline. And what I found challenging in my initial attempt is that when I did it first, I did one and then I did the other, and they didn't quite line up. So now I'm trying to learn from that experience and draw them together, especially kind of working out that basic perspective together. Because what had happened is that when I had first drawn it, this leg was just too long, and it made the whole thing feel like it was tilting up incorrectly out of the water. So I want to avoid that here. But again, I'm just going to keep this relatively sketchy because we want to get this thing moving. So that works out a little better. Let's see. This feels a bit too, like it's leaning too much. So that's coming together. I mostly just want to get the basic values and the basic shape right so that it's not a distraction, but I won't go into much more detail. There's a little bit of a kind of shadow under the water there. And then we get some kind of reflection here in the water. Kind of drop in some of that using these short kind of horizontal marks, using the side of the pencil to kind of create more naturally appearing marks. And actually, I want to darken this whole area. I want to drop down in value. And that kind of creates more of that atmosphere. And I don't know, I kind of like the way this is kind of trailing off a little bit, so I may just leave that. Maybe a little bit more, give it a little bit more structure back in here, but kind of enhance that atmospheric effect there. And then right in here, give a little bit more structure to these stones here. But I think I'm going to call it done since we're a little over 2 hours. My goal is to get it in under 2 hours, but didn't quite make it. What do you all think? How did your drawings turn out? Love to hear how it went, see how your drawings turned out. So share your work when you're done. I'll hang out for a few more questions here. Let's see. Well, it's so fascinating to watch the drawing come to life. But I don't think you'll tackle the subject. Oh, you can do it. But I hear you. Some of them I really questioned whether I had made a good choice, but I had kind of gone too far to back out. So I did this one. But yeah, it was hard. I tell you. And so you choose the subjects that work best for you. And it may not be the time for you to work on this subject, but it may come in later for you. So use your gut, follow your gut. Yeah, and I'm happy Amy saying, nice thing is that when it's finished, no one will have to see the original sitting next to it to compare. So you won't see the proportions as much. That is one of the nice things too, is that, and I've definitely used that argument on my own work many times, is say, hey, no one's ever going to see the original subject. So does the drawing or the painting stand on its own effectively? That's the question. Cleaning that up because that was a bit of a distraction. And then this is, what I'm observing right now is that because of the glare here in the studio, I'm seeing things a little bit differently than the way they appear on the screen. So I'm just evaluating based on what you all are seeing and making some adjustments there. So, all right. Monica's saying, where can we get the photo before next week's video? I believe I already posted the link to next week's drawing, the Mockingbird. And so it should be in the description there. Or if you go to artistnetwork.com, you'll find it there if you go to the Drawing Together page. So there's a link pinned to the top of the chat. And you'll be able to, if you go to that, you'll see today's drawing and next week's drawing. You click on the image there of the Mockingbird, and that'll take you to the landing page where you'll find the reference image there. Or if you find it on YouTube, it'll be there as well. So let's see, Cheryl's saying, I have to stop. Wait, you have to stop and set it up away from me. Yeah, that's a good idea. My studio is part of a living room. I set drawing on both the bookcase and the mantle. That's a great idea. The farther away you can put it, the better, in my opinion. And then you kind of walk up to it and evaluate each step, kind of evaluate and see how things change. All right, thank you everybody. I really appreciate it. I think it turned out okay. There's some issues I think with it that I might adjust later, but I feel like it captures the spirit of the subject, kind of pushes the atmospheric perspective a little bit farther from the original. The perspective, at least it doesn't seem too distractingly off. It seems to work. Yeah, I think if I were to continue to work on it, I might pump up the contrast just a little bit more. Up in this area up here, for example, maybe a little bit more in that space down there. Maybe add a little bit more weight down here by toning the sky in a little bit more. It's darker in the reference image than what I have here. So I might do things like that, but I think for today, I think I need to stop. So thank you all for joining me. Thank you all for sharing your experiences. If you're new, welcome. I can't wait to see you next week as well. So have a happy new year. And we will see you all we'll see you all next year. It'll be on the 6th. So I appreciate it. You all have a great weekend.